Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whichever applies to you. I thought we would begin by going over just a few slides, 7 or 8, I guess, that have to do with our first unit, or our first reading assignment, and that is reading fiction. I rather like Mark Twain's observation that a person who chooses not to read has no advantage over a person who is unable to read. It's a pretty wise statement. And so we can begin our discussion by asking the question, why bother to read fiction? Why do people enjoy or why are they drawn to reading stories that are made up? And I guess the first reason is that it's enjoyable. And that should always be the first aim of our reading. Certainly there are things that we enjoy reading more than others, but the first joy of reading is exactly that it gives us some kind of pleasure. It makes our life less tedious. It can help us relax after a long day, or it can help us make a long plane ride maybe a little more enjoyable. And then maybe the second response to the question might be for understanding. And this is an important point, I think, that just because a story is fictional or that it's made up does not mean that it is not valuable. In other words, we can agree, I think, that imagined experiences can provide us with authentic insights. And these insights can broaden our experiences and our understanding of people whose lives might be different than ours. It can give us deeper insight into the lives that we are living and the people with whom we are living. Sometimes students mistakenly associate literature more with school than with life. Accustomed to reading it in order to write a paper or to pass an examination, students sometimes perceive reading as a chore instead of a pleasurable opportunity, something considerably less important than studying for the practical courses that prepare them for a career. The study of literature, however, is practical because it engages you in the kinds of problem solving important in a variety of fields, from philosophy to science and technology. The interpretation of literary texts requires you to deal with uncertainties, with value judgments, with emotions, and these are unavoidable aspects of life. As F. Scott Fitzgerald once astutely described, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Your textbook does a pretty good job of introducing two broad categories of fiction to you: formula fiction and literary fiction. So we're going to spend a few slides discussing the qualities of each category. If you think about it, storytelling is as basic to the human experience as breathing is. Think about it. As children, we crave story time, didn't we? We love to be told stories, to read stories. Think of those special childhood books that you enjoyed, and even though you had read them 100 times, you still wanted to be read to again. That's why I always tell my students, one of the best things you can do when you become a parent is to read stories to your children. That time is a magical, imaginative time, a wonderful bonding time between parent and child. And moreover, you're instilling in your child that appreciation for stories and for words and for language. And if you do that, and you do that early, it will pay just extraordinary dividends. I found that with my children, all 4 of them, and I know you will too. Your book does a really good job of explaining the characteristics of formula fiction. Formula fiction is written primarily for enjoyment, okay? Pleasure is the main object. It helps us pass time agreeably. But the most important point I want to draw to your attention is this last idea here, that formula fiction is crafted in such a way that it takes the reader away from the real world. In short, formula fiction is really an escape. It's an adventure. Think of the genres of the Western, the detective stories, science fiction, the romance stories that entertain so many millions of readers every year. The sole purpose of these stories is to take us away from our lives and from our experience, to experience something that is exotic, something that is foreign, something that is rare, something that we usually don't get to experience for ourselves. So we're living vicariously through the characters in the story. Characteristics of literary fiction. Literary fiction is generally written to broaden, to deepen, to sharpen our awareness of life. Its purpose is to illuminate really some aspect of human life or human behavior. Certainly pleasure is one of the objectives, but it's pleasure plus understanding or insight really are the objectives of the piece of literary fiction. Literary fiction will take us deeper into the real world. It will give us a keener awareness of what it is to be a human being in a universe that's sometimes friendly and sometimes not. The literary canon includes works considered by scholars, critics, and teachers to be the most important to read and study. It's important for you to remember, though, that the literary canon has changed significantly over the years. In other words, works that were once held in high regard for their literary value may or may not be held in as high a regard today. And conversely, stories that were written and virtually ignored when they were published or were considered formulaic, later generations may discover something literary in them. So the whole literary landscape is subject to shifting, and I just want you to keep that in mind. For example, Moby Dick by Herman Melville was virtually panned by the critics in 1850, and it really wasn't until the 1930s, the very beginning of the 20th century, when critics began to re-examine Melville's work long after Melville had died, and they began to see things, textures and themes and certain decisions that he made in plot and characterization and so forth, and symbolism, and they began to see value in that. So I just give you that little bit of information to keep in mind. In other words, the point being is that just because something may be perceived as formulaic today does not mean that future generations will dismiss it or see it similarly. It's subject to change. It has to change with the various generation, various cultures, as those values and assumptions and tastes change. There are different types of readers, just as there are different types of moviegoers or different types of television viewers, right? There are readers who find their demands gratified by formula fiction. And there are readers who seek out literary fiction as well. And this class is, and most college-level literature classes, you should know, are courses that are devoted to literary fiction. Let's think for a moment about what readers of formula fiction expect. Generally, the formula fiction reader expects that what they read is going to return them certain things. Usually it's a pleasant or exciting image of the world, or perhaps more dangerously, some flattering image of themselves, right? Usually the formula fiction is going to have a happily ever after ending. It's going to present the reader, or the reader expects to meet some kind of sympathetic hero or a sympathetic heroine, one with whom the reader may identify, right? Usually the formula fiction is going to present an exciting plot. Usually it's a physical plot. Usually the conflicts in formula fiction are a physical sort of conflict, okay? Not very cerebral, right? In other words, not using the head very much, but rather the heart. Usually if the formula story has a theme, it's one that's not very challenging, or it's not one that's very controversial. In other words, the theme, if it has one, is going to, or is not going to, I should say, challenge the reader's view or his or her opinions of the world, right? Remember, this is why people are drawn to the formulaic story. It's an escape, right? They don't want to be reminded about how ambiguous life is, or how perhaps pessimistic our lives can be. The formulaic story is the escape from our lives. It's the romantic adventure, right? It's out west. It's the detective story. It's Fabio on the cover of the romance story, right? So what that formulaic fiction gives readers is an escape. It's always going to give us a happily ever after ending. Sure, there may be conflict, there may be suspense, but at the end of the day, the hero or the heroine will succeed, right? Virtue will triumph, love will conquer all, honesty will prevail as the best policy, hard work will pay off and guarantee success, despite the reality that those ideas do not always hold water in the real world, in our lives, right? We've lived long enough to know that sometimes hard work doesn't pay off. Sometimes love doesn't conquer all. Sometimes we don't get the girl, right? So this is something to keep in mind. But remember, the formulaic piece of fiction is designed commercially. In other words, it's designed to sell, right? And so it has to be crafted in such a way that it's going to draw people in. It's going to make them want to read it. And you're generally not going to make people want to read things that don't, or that challenge them, or that shake the very foundations of who they are or what they believe their experiences to be. Let me give you another little insight into formulaic fiction versus commercial fiction. You all are familiar with Nathaniel Hawthorne. Consider for a moment his most popular work, The Scarlet Letter, which was published in March of 1850. Only 11,800 copies of The Scarlet Letter had been produced by 1860. So in 10 years, right, between 1850 and 1860, only 11,800 copies of that novel existed, right? Now consider this. By contrast, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This piece of fiction, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is an awful book if you've tried to read it. It was an extraordinarily important book, but it was not an extraordinarily well-written or well-crafted book. By contrast, Harriet Beecher Stowe's sold, I think, 300,000 copies in the same time span. Okay. Another thing to consider, think about this as far as the commercial appeal of The Scarlet Letter. It was published in 1850, and Hawthorne died in 1864. So in the 14 years that book was in circulation and Hawthorne was alive, The Scarlet Letter earned Nathaniel Hawthorne a whopping $1,500. Readers of literary fiction enjoy fiction that deals realistically with life. They also enjoy fiction that expands our breadth of experience, both emotionally and intellectually. That's not to say that readers of literary fiction do not enjoy formulaic fiction, though. There are times when I want to pick up a book that's not going to challenge me emotionally or intellectually. There are times when I want that escape, and when those times come, I know where I can go, right, for a good escape formulaic story that's going to take me on an adventure. But there are other times when I want to be challenged intellectually and I want to be challenged emotionally. I want to be pushed into areas philosophically, intellectually, emotionally that cause me to grow. Okay, that's because I know that escape fiction serves a purpose, but it can be dangerous, really, if that's all one reads. If all one does is fill himself or herself, right, with formulaic fiction, think about how potentially dangerous that is, right? I mean, it really distorts our sense of reality, and it can lead us to expect from experience what experience does not simply provide, right? Think about it as nutrition, okay? It's a good analogy, really. If all we do is feed our bodies with things that make us feel good or things that taste good, right? As much as we like it, as pleasurable as that would be, we're not going to be able to stay in shape. We're not going to keep healthy, right? I would like nothing more than to just have milkshakes and eat pizza and cheeseburgers and French fries and pie. Man, I'd love it because it would taste so good. But I can't do that. It's dangerous if I do that, right? Think about that documentary, the McDonald's one, right? Super Size Me, right? It's not nutritionally wise to do that physically for your bodies. It's the same thing with what we read. It's not intellectually wise to always fill our heads with formulaic stories where the conflicts are always resolved in such a way that the hero prevails, right? That the boy gets the girl, that good always triumphs over evil. It's not good because it can distort what we expect out of life. If what we're filling our heads with is this idea that Prince Charming is going to come and he is going to rescue me and he is going to whisk me away to some exotic European villa to live out the span of my days, and that together we're going to have children with good bone structure and dizzying wit and intellects, that's a dangerous recipe. I mean, it's a recipe for disaster, right? It's not going to happen. That's kind of depressing, isn't it? I'm sorry. I realize that I've gone on longer than I intended to, and I apologize for that. My intention is to try to keep these short, like 10, 15 minutes, and I know I've gone over here. So thank you for indulging me. I hope that you enjoy reading the first two stories in our book, which really do illustrate, I think, the differences in quality between formula and literary fiction. Okay? You'll see the difference. You'll know which is which. Okay? If you have any questions about these two stories or about any other stories that we're reading this semester, always feel free to post those questions on the discussion board. And again, that's one of the things that we do as readers. We discuss what we read, right? That's one of the pleasures and one of the joys of reading, is to share ideas, share our reactions, our responses to the things that we're reading, okay? So I'm really looking forward to this semester. I hope that you got your book. I hope that things are getting settled for you. Let me know if I can do anything at all to help you get started. See you soon.